All right, this last section of the chapter, we're really going to talk about sort of forgetting or generally memory errors and how those might take place. So, we're going to talk first here about some memory errors and specifically Shader's kind of 7 sins of memory. And so we'll kind of put these up here, and actually let me get out of the way here. So talking about these 7 sins, we kind of break these into 2 main categories. The first being errors of omission. So this is really where we've left things out entirely, or errors of commission, which is where we are kind of remembering the wrong information. So if we break each of these down, we can see that the 3 errors of omission are first transience, which is generally just the idea that like we forget things over time. So things go away, we lose information, and as time comes, we lose information. And we're going to talk about 2 different ways of information maybe interfering and kind of having to do with transience here as well on the next slide. Then we have absent-mindedness, which is really just where we haven't encoded the information even at all in the first place, where we just kind of weren't paying attention. We didn't encode the information to start, and so it's not there to be retrieved later on. And then we have blocking, which is just sort of a temporary memory failure, or like for some reason we just can't remember whatever it is we're trying to remember. Sort of the tip of the tongue phenomenon. It's there, but we just can't quite access it. And then we have our errors of commission. So this is where we're really like constructing the information incorrectly or inaccurately, and we're just not really correctly remembering what that information might be. So the first one of misattribution, which is where we're really just kind of like we're assigning something to the wrong thing. So maybe we have things like deja vu, and we are saying that this is what happened, or we've seen this in the past, but really we haven't actually experienced this. So we might be just assigning something to something else when it really didn't happen. We'll talk about some examples of this as well through some flashbulb memories and some other specific examples here in a minute. Then we have suggestibility, which is basically that, as we reconstruct our memories, or, as we are remembering things that we've seen, we might be suggestible to other influences or other factors that might change how we remembered those pieces of information. Again, I'm going to talk about this one a little bit more going forward. And then we have bias, which is, again, maybe our beliefs, our stereotypes, our own mental biases just frame how we're remembering things. And that can, again, affect our memory and make our memory less accurate than we think it is, or that it should be. And then lastly, we have persistence, which is just basically our inability to stop unwanted memories from taking place in our consciousness. An example of this is things like PTSD or flashbacks, where we are remembering things in a heightened state or in a more meaningful state than they should be, and they might be causing some disturbance or distress or things like that. All right, so let's talk about some interference theories here as well, and kind of get into this idea a little bit of how information can kind of overwrite or interfere with memories in this case. And so there's really 2 different types of interference. There's retroactive interference and proactive interference. So with retroactive interference, we have some new memory is interfering with some old memory, right? So maybe that is, you were supposed to remember a series of numbers and you had those numbers remembered. And then I start giving you a bunch of new numbers to remember, and you have to remember those. And now you've forgotten the old ones. And so that would be retroactive interference. On the other hand, we have proactive interference, which is where old memories interfere with our ability to remember new things. So in that same number example, let's say, you are going through a series of trials in an experiment where you have to remember numbers. And first you remember the numbers 1, 2, 3. And then in the next trial, you remember the numbers 2, 3, 4. And then in the next trial, you remember the numbers, 4, 5, 6. And you go on and you go on and you go on. And then at some point, I give you a series of numbers to remember, and you say, was this in the trial I just did, or was this one of the ones from the past, right? So maybe I was like, oh, no, I remember this from before, but now I can't remember this new one because all I'm remembering is the ones from my first few trials. And so both of these 2 interference patterns can affect our ability to remember things and affect our ability to form memories, but it kind of works in both directions, and it just might depend on the context or the importance of where you've placed information and what type of interference pattern you're seeing. We also talked a little bit about errors of commission, and specifically here talking about suggestibility. And there's been a lot of research done on this, and there's some really interesting research that looks at how suggestible our memories actually can be. Specifically when looking at things like eyewitness testimony and different studies looking at how we remember events, we are very, very inaccurate in how we do this. Some famous studies that have looked at this have looked at just presenting participants with different, very minimal information and seeing how much that changes their recreation of events. So a particular study done by Elizabeth Loftus looked at, actually they presented participants with a video of a car crash, and it was the same car crash in all participants. And some participants then were asked how fast were the cars going when they bumped into each other or when they hit each other. And then other participants were asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into each other. And just with that little bit of change in the verbs that were used, that smashed has enough suggestibility that participants in that group reported much higher speeds, that they remembered the cars going much faster when they hit each other. And so this really kind of demonstrates and highlights how suggestible, how fragile our memories can be, and how we can have these errors of commission, these errors of remembering due to things like suggestibility. Another example here is this idea of flashbulb memories. So flashbulb memories are really interesting and really cool, and studying them is really interesting as well. But when we look at this, some examples of this have been looked at in, say, 9/11 and how we remember things from 9/11. And so in this particular example, participant 1, here, let me kind of jump out of the way again. In this example, we can see participant 1 had, they told researchers what they remembered during the times of the events. And so immediately afterwards, in 2001, they said they were in the kitchen making breakfast when they first found out about 9/11, or about sort of what happened. And then a year later, they claimed that they were in their dorm room folding laundry. And then a few years later, they were ironing in their dorm room, and then in their dorm room, ironing. And so you can see that pretty early on, those memories might change, and then they kind of stay consistent over time. The same thing sort of in participant 2. How did they find out? Well, early on, they said from the Today Show. And then a year later, they said some girl in their dorm rushed in and told them. And then again, 2004, a girl came into my room. 2011, a girl came into my room. And so early on, those memories are formed, but they might change. But what's really interesting about flashbulb memories is that the confidence in the memories remains very high. So while the accuracy sort of degrades over time, the confidence does not, and people remain highly confident in these memories over other forms of memory. And so the last thing we'll kind of talk about here is this idea of forgetting, and specifically with amnesia. So these are more physical or actual damage to the brain that can cause this type of amnesia or this type of forgetting. And there are two main types of amnesia that we can look at. Retrograde amnesia, which is where we lose memories prior to or before some specific event that took place, like getting in a car accident, causing some damage. And oftentimes these are only temporary. These might come back later on, and generally are relatively short-lived. And then we have anterograde amnesia, which is the inability to form new memories. These tend to be more permanent, more long-lasting due to actual damage to the regions that are memory-forming regions within the mind. So we see examples specifically in regions like the hippocampus due to different types of disease or syndromes that might cause these specific damages. So again, two forms of amnesia, two forms of forgetting. One, retrograde, has to do with forgetting things from the past. Anterograde has to do with forgetting things from the future, or not being able to form new memories going forward.